Hello everybody, and welcome back to Notes on Ningyô, our ongoing video series where we explore the fascinating contours of Japanese doll history. My name is Alan Scott Pate, and in each episode we try to explore a different facet, expose a different side of Japanese ningyô culture. This week, episode 17, we're looking at one of the more celebrated ichimatsu-ningyô artists, Takizawa Kôryûsai. So the title of this work, Master Craftsman, the Life and Works of Koryusai. In our previous episode, episode 16, we looked at how to evaluate Japanese ichimatsu-ningyô, looking at their faces, looking at their hands, looking at their textiles, looking at the artists that made them in a way to sort of help us develop skill sets where we could determine the quality of these dolls, good, better, best, whether they're worth buying or really you should just move right along. And part of this was to sort of avoid what I call the dreaded, they all look alike syndrome. And that's where people not so familiar with ichimatsu-ningyô look at them, they look at their textiles, they look at hairstyle, and they think, well, they kind of all look alike. And for me, I'm a little horrified by all of that. But in preparing for this talk on Koryusai, I came across this. Now, this is an advertisement from Taryot's Doll Auctions. Taryot's world-renowned for selling dolls of all ilk, but particularly known for their French bisque dolls. And I saw this page, and I said to myself, well, they all look alike. And I'm sure people who are more versed in the French doll world would say, oh, please. But if you read more carefully, you have dolls here by Émile Jumeau, Jules Steiner, Rabert and Delfieux, Mothereau, and Gaultier. Well, some of these names, I suppose, Jumeau, I'm familiar with Jumeau. Steiner I'm kind of hip to because of technology that overlap with Japanese doll technology. But the others, I have no idea. I can't evaluate them. So to me, they all look alike. And hence the importance of a presentation such as this to help individuals understand why the Japanese dolls don't all look alike. And who are the artists that made them, that make them special. And so for this week, we're going to focus on Koryusai. Now, Koryusai is arguably the most important ichimatsu-ningyô craftsman of the early 20th century. And I'll get into why I say that statement later. But when you look at his pieces, they are just extraordinary for the brightness of their expression, the quality of the materials he used. But these are things that my eye recognize. But someone who hasn't been exposed to Koryusai's history, or any number of Koryusai's dolls may not be able to differentiate between a Koryusai and a Shokensai, any more than I could differentiate between a Steiner and a Jumeau. Mea culpa. This is just how it works if you don't have the information. So this video is to help provide that information. Takizawa Kôryûsai, personal name Toyotarô, and this is a picture of him taken in 1927 along with a sampling of what his signature and seal frequently look like that you find within the ichimatsu. He began his life son of Takizawa Heikichi, who was also an ichimatsu-ningyô artist based in Tokyo. He was an apprentice to Tokusai, a very, very important atelier and maker in the Tokyo area, supplier to the imperial family, made dolls for the upper crust out of his shop at the Jukendana section of Nihonbashi. Exquisite dolls, exquisite maker. Tokusai II, second generation, who Heikichi studied under, was known for the precision of his work, the beauty of his textiles, and these are reflected in the dolls that are still extant, the many Tokusai dolls that are still extant. And I actually did a deep dive into Tokusai and his lineage back in episode 15 of Notes on Ningyô, and so that's a video that you can all source if you were so inclined. But interestingly, Heikichi was not all that interested in becoming a ningyô maker. He worked for Tokusai, who happened to be his uncle through his mother's side. And in the late Meiji era, Heikichi was given the opportunity to travel to America on a business embassy through Okura Kihachiro, a very prominent Meiji era businessman. And he tapped Heikichi to go, but Tokusai seeing Heikichi's talent, not wanting to lose Heikichi, sort of prevented that from happening, and Heikichi remained a doll artist there in Tokyo, making dolls, helping dolls, assisting Eitokisai as his deshi in the enterprise. Now, those of you who have seen the Eitokisai talk will know this pair of Eitokisai dolls, which I find just absolutely mesmerizing in terms of scale. They're quite large, beautiful depiction, very much state-of-the-art back in the Meiji era, made for the Takamatsu-no-miya imperial branch of the imperial family. And this is the Prince Takamatsu-no-miya, taken in 1930, but as just an idea of the level of the social milieu that Eitokisai was working in. I recently purchased a book at auction by Nishizawa Tekiho, and I found a photograph. The first image I showed you was hand tinted, and here's an actual, a more untouched photograph of these dolls, and I find them just so absolutely stunning. But part of Heikichi's job in working with the imperial family, imperial household, as clerk, would be to go to the imperial palace to deliver the dolls, and then also to await payment, which was called osage watashi. So not only were doll makers delivering goods to the imperial palace, but lacquer workers, every ilk of craftsmen would be there delivering their goods or waiting to receive payment. And they would sit in an area and while away the hours, waiting for either reception to deliver or waiting for their osage watashi payment. And evidently, this group was fond of gambling, and they would while away the hours gambling. Some were successful, some were not. And unfortunately, Heikichi was not so successful. And not only did he lose his own money, but he lost the osage watashi payment from the imperial family to gambling. And he had to go back to the Eitokisai studio and explain, or didn't actually explain, he sort of punted and said that he hadn't gotten the osage watashi back yet. So he went out, doubled down on his gambling, borrowed a tremendous amount of money, made a big bet, and fortunately was able to recoup his losses and pay off his debt. But he forswore gambling at that point. So when you see this early picture of Heikichi, he's actually dressed more in Shinto, as a Shinto priest. And this is emblematic of his vow never to gamble again, or so family lore says. But Heikichi was an ichimatsu maker, developing on his own, ultimately went independent as Koryusai I, Shodai Koryusai. Evidently also, his market was, he was very popular in the Kyoto area, much more so than Tokyo, not sure exactly why. And very few pieces of his are known to today. And so here is arguably the most famous piece by Heikichi, a young ichimatsu boy. And when you compare him to other Meiji era, this would have been done in the Meiji era, so the late 1800s, late 19th century, and you compare that to another maker, Takeuchi Masujiro there, you can see a certain similarity, the very well-formed ears, large well-formed ears, the large eyes that were sometimes referred to as ginkgo nut eyes because of the size, the lips with the very heavy ridges. This was sort of the aesthetic of ichimatsu boys during the day, and Heikichi sort of shared that aesthetic in his ichimatsu-ningyô, or from what we can tell at any rate. So that particular doll, the Heikichi doll that's so famous, was actually purchased by a very famous individual, Fukuzawa Yukichi. Yukichi was a member of the literati. He actually joined the first Japanese diplomatic embassy to the U.S. in 1860 as a clerk, and he's pictured there on the far right as a young man in 1860 traveling to America as part of the embassy. He was also founder of Keio University there in Tokyo, so a man of enlightenment, very advocating Western studies and Western technology be incorporated into Japanese society, and a very seminal figure in Japanese history. He had 5 daughters, and the doll in question was given to Fukuzawa Shun, his middle daughter, pictured there on the far left, standing on the far left. Now, Fukuzawa Shun had this doll and then passed it on to her son, Kyoka Eiichi. And so Eiichi-san is shown here holding the doll. And we can see a wooden box there on the lower right with the phrase "Ai mitate warau" inscribed in calligraphy there. And that means we laugh when we meet each other. And according to Eiichi's reminiscence, he always loved that title more than the doll. He loved that title. Now, in preparing for this talk, I sort of got lost down a little rabbit hole because Eiichi himself, Professor Emeritus at Keio University, grandson of Fukuzawa Yukichi, and foremost biographer of this important individual, Fukuzawa Yukichi, actually traveled to the United States in 1920 when he was about 18 or 19 years old to attend university in New York State. And he was there for about 7 years. And in 1925, he bought a used Model T Ford that he used for Sunday rambles around the countryside. He became so enamored with this car and learned to take it apart and put it back together again that upon graduating and needing to return to Japan, typically you would take a train cross country, board a boat in San Francisco and be on your way. But he decided that he wanted to drive his his used Model T Ford from New York all the way to San Francisco. And so he tapped his best friend who was newly married. And so on their honeymoon, he accompanied Eiichi cross country. And what is particularly fascinating is that Eiichi bought a Kodak movie camera and documented the whole thing. And so this movie, if you will, of Eiichi driving cross country in his Model T Ford in 1927 as he returns back to Japan is still extant. And so I fell in love with his sense of adventure and spirit. But as they say, I digress. So fast forward, and here is Eiichi-san holding his doll. And there's the picture there, and you can again see the box. But when you hear Eiichi, you read Eiichi's interviews and discussions about this doll, as I said, he really loved the title, Ai mitate wararu, meaning that, we laugh when we meet each other, but he wasn't really interested in the doll because when it was owned by its mother, the doll was dressed as a girl. And when Eiichi-san decided that it needed to be restored, he was able to secure fabric, kimono fabric, from his famous grandfather, Fukuzawa Yukichi, and have the doll repaired and restored by Yoshitoku, and that's how you see it today. But it's interesting to me to think that originally, when Fukuzawa Yukichi first bought this doll and gave it to his daughter, Fukuzawa Shun, it was actually not a boy doll, but a girl doll. There are no extant images of it at that point, but through a little, sort of Photoshop magic, we can sort of see what this doll might have looked like when it was the beloved possession of Fukuzawa Shun back in the late Meiji era. Now, we don't know what hairstyle it wore, but in presenting this to a doll club recently, we got into a conversation about the physiognomy of doll faces, male, female, and one member, a physician, piped in that children up to a certain age before hormones kick in are, aside from clothing and hairstyle, pretty much indistinguishable, that there's not necessarily a male face or a female face. And so when you compare the dolls, doll makers actually understood this. And so dolls depicting children of 5 or 7 years old, the faces, male or female, are interchangeable, and it has to deal with clothing, it has to do with hairstyle. And so here is Ai mitate wararu as a boy, and then the same doll as a girl, but wearing Fukuzawa Yukichi's kimono. So very interesting aside. Again, like I said, a rabbit hole that I fell into and wanted to share. But let's move on. Koryusai Toyotarô was Heikichi's only son. And he apprenticed with his father in traditional manner, just as Heikichi had apprenticed with Eitokusai. Toyotarô apprenticed with his father, Heikichi. But evidently, Toyotarô was a brilliant student and very rapidly earned clients of his own, and so had a reputation of his own apart from his father as a very, very young man. So when his father passed in 1910, Koryusai, or Toyotarô, was able to take over the Koryusai lineage as Koryusai II and embark on a very successful career, but beginning at the tender age of 18 or 19 years old. Throughout the Taisho era, which is basically 1912 through 1926, Koryusai continued to make ichimatsu-ningyô of very, very high quality, selling to ateliers such as Maruhei Okiheizo in Kyoto, Yoshitoku in Tokyo, among others. Now, likely his pieces worked their way into the imperial family, but rather than being a supplier to the imperial family himself, he worked with ateliers who were in turn suppliers to the imperial family. So continuing in a very prestigious lineage of very, very high quality dolls. And when we compare an example of Koryusai 2 with his father, Koryusai 1, you can see a certain similarity, the fullness of the cheeks, the roundness, the way the chin cut is made, the rigid lines of the lips, the ginkgo nut eyes, the eyebrows, slightly different, but very narrow and painted as opposed to feathered. And so you can see sort of a similarity father-son. But Koryusai was nothing if not a diligent, dedicated artisan to his craft. Physically, he was known for being quite large, having a strong physical presence, a strong personality, sort of loud and boisterous. He actually liked to collect guns, and police kept tabs on his weaponry to make sure that he hadn't fired. So periodically the police would go by his house, check that he still had all his guns, and more importantly, that he still had all his bullets, that he wasn't firing his gun, which would have been illegal. So, an unusual personality to say the least. But he was also known for his dedication as an artisan, and he would walk around the city with a sketchbook in hand, and seeing people with interesting faces, he would sketch them intently, sometimes following them. And in one notable instance, he was following a young woman to sketch her and was diligently sketching her, but she caught sight of him and began to fear, and so she ran into a police station, and Koryusai was arrested temporarily for stalking this poor young woman. All he was doing was drawing, but he was so intent on it that she became scared, and he was arrested, and his son-in-law, who was a policeman, had to actually come and bail him out of jail. So a colorful character indeed, and I like providing this sort of background coloratura, if you will, to show the personality behind the artist that created the beautiful dolls that we admire so much today. And as I said, in the Taisho era, he was known for creating dolls of exquisite quality, but also of quite large scale. His dolls frequently are in the 30-inch range, and so this is a beautiful Taisho era pair that I profiled in my last talk, showing all the skill sets that he brought to bear to his dolls. And again, this is about a 30-inch tall pair, absolutely beautiful, still showing that early aesthetic with the ginkgo eyes and the lips. But the skill sets, the painting, the fine painting of the hair, and then, as I profiled in the last talk, that beautiful foot showing the naturalism and the realism of it. I really have always absolutely adored this particular pair as representative of Koryusai during the Taisho era. And here's the boy again with his signature cloth exposed, showing the signature of Koryusai and his seal. Now, Koryusai was pretty much at the peak of his game in 1927 when the friendship doll movement came to town, so to speak. And interestingly, because he was so famous and because he was known for these large-scale dolls, and also this is in the aftermath of the Great Kanto earthquake, which destroyed many sections of Tokyo, Koryusai was the only doll artisan in Tokyo in possession of a mold set large enough to create the 83 centimeter or 32-inch doll form that the Japanese government had envisioned for the friendship dolls, the Torei Ningyô return gesture dolls. So they turned to Koryusai to help to create the base templates that were sent out and used by the various ichimatsu-ningyô artists to create what became the friendship dolls out of Tokyo. And he became something of a poster child for the entire movement to the Western audience. That photograph that I just previously showed was reprinted in newspapers all across the country. And when you do archival digs to newspapers just from one end of the country to the other during the summer of 1927, frequently you'll find this image. And of course, they spelled his name wrong as Toyotarô Takizawa instead of Zawa, but there you go. That's him in his studio working with his apprentice to help get some of the dolls ready for the friendship doll exchange. Now, out of the some 200 templates that were sent out, only 50 1 were accepted as Tokyo-made dolls for the Friendship Doll project. Of course, it was an amazing 58 dolls were made, but 7 of those were manufactured or made in Kyoto, a different style, another talk. But the 51 Tokyo ichimatsu-ningyô were created by a total of 9 artists. Although other artists submitted works, only 9 artists had their works accepted. And I profile this entire endeavor somewhat in depth in my book, Art as Ambassador, The Japanese Friendship Dolls of 1927, and it's available on my website. But further research, subsequent to my publication of that book, largely through Dr. Tanaka Keiko, who has access to the Goyo family archives, we've now been able to determine with great specificity the number of dolls that each of the 9 artists contributed to the project. Prior to that, it was known that Koryusai made many, but we didn't know exactly how many. Goyo, of course, known for making only 5 dolls, but his 5 dolls were seen as, well, the best of the best, superlative, and that's talk for another time. Iwamoto Shigesaburo, or Shokensai, one, a peer of Koryusai and very much a competitor. Shokensai really saw Koryusai as the benchmark or the level to strive to, and there was a sense of competitiveness, friendly competitiveness between the two. And Shokensai was responsible for 10 of the dolls. Koryusai, however, was responsible for 25 of the 51 dolls sent. That's a chunk. That's, nearly half of all the dolls were made by Takizawa Kôryûsai too. So obviously very, very important. And also meaningful for me personally, because the first friendship doll I encountered, the first friendship doll that I had the honor to own, was Miss Fukushima, a beautiful doll by Takizawa Kôryûsai. Evincing all of the hallmarks of his work, again at the peak of his game. Beautiful, beautiful dolls. I won't go through all of them, and rather than telling their stories, which I've done in other videos, just looking at the artistry that Koryusai brought to the friendship dolls that he created. So this is Miss Akita, and she's at the Detroit Children's Museum. Lovely face. Again, Koryusai known for his bright and happy, very positive expressions. Miss Fukuoka in University in Eugene, at the University in Eugene, Oregon. Absolutely beautiful Koryusai girl. And then my favorite, I can't say that because I have so many, but Ms. Mie, which is actually in Lincoln, Nebraska, her open mouth expression, so bright-eyed, so happy. You just can't help but smile when you see Ms. Mie. And one has to think back to that first doll by Koryusai's father, Ai mitate warau. When we meet, we laugh, and this is what she's doing. You see her, to know her is to smile. Absolutely beautiful. So of the extant dolls, friendship dolls, we have 18 by Koryusai. And that tells us, since he made 25, that 7 of his dolls are still missing. So thus out of the 11 missing dolls, over half again, 7 of them are going to be Koryusai dolls. One of these was the original Miss Tokyo Fu, a beautiful open-faced doll that was originally placed in Philadelphia, so we believe, missing. But not all have a sad story. This doll, Miss Hiroshima, also the original Miss Hiroshima, also by Koryusai, was long missing, but was discovered by Dr. Marv and his wife Flo Herring at an antique fair in New Jersey. And they bought the doll and brought her home, and she was part of their collection for many years and identified as the original Miss Hiroshima. Still don't know what museum she was originally placed in, if at all. But now she's been transferred, ownership has been transferred to the Berry Art Museum in Norfolk, Virginia. And this is Aoki Masaru from Yoshitoku inspecting her, gave her a very light, what I call a fluff and fold there at the museum in Norfolk, taking off the kimono, all the undergarments to inspect condition. And this is an interesting photograph because when you look at her kimono, you can see how much the fading has taken place, and that originally it was a very cherry blossom pink, rosé kind of color, and now it's sort of evenly faded. And she does need to go back to Japan for a full conservative treatment, but because of COVID, that journey hasn't taken place yet. So hopefully the Berry Art Museum will be able to effectuate that before too terribly long to bring Miss Hiroshima back to her full glory. This is the signature of Koryusai underneath the kimono and the label of the Tokyo Doll Wholesale Traders Association, which is a must for all friendship dolls, as I explained before. And so this is Carolyn Berry, the founder of the museum, and myself when she first arrived there. Now, currently at least with this video here in February of 2022, she is part of an exhibit at the Berry Art Museum focusing on the life and works of Hirata Goyo, but the friendship doll, an important component of that. So here she is with a friendship doll by Hirata Goyo, and the title of the exhibit, Hirata Goyo, The Birth of the Japanese Art Doll. And this is important for our discussion here today because Goyo went on taking his fame in ostensibly the friendship doll ichimatsu, and took it in a different direction, moving into the art doll movement. It's notable that prior to the friendship doll, the Goyo lineage was not known for their ichimatsu-ningyô, and he was sort of laughed at when he announced his intention to participate, but the last laugh was on him because he made such beautiful dolls. But after the movement, he continued to make ichimatsu-ningyô, but focused more on art dolls, whereas Koryusai, the consummate craftsman, didn't see himself as an artist, but saw himself as a consummate craftsman focused on his beloved ichimatsu. Here he was some, 18 years into his career as an ichimatsu-ningyô maker, and throughout the rest of his life, that's what he focused on. He didn't branch out into the art dolls that Goyo did and Gyokusui and other ichimatsu-ningyô makers. He focused only on his beloved ichimatsu and refined them to a wonderful level with these bright, loving, happy expressions that are one of the hallmarks of Koryusai ichimatsu. And with the quality of his work, not surprisingly, the kimono that adorn these dolls, whether male or female, are of a very high caliber and are worth, study alone. And so here's a beautiful Koryusai boy in the back of his haori showing a Boys' Day helmet, beautifully, painterly executed. Again, known for, this is the girl that we saw at the very, very beginning of the talk. Beautiful face, lovely eye. Again, Koryusai at his peak. Again, the hands we discussed in the previous video, episode 16, just showing the quality that he brought to all the elements, but the kimono. I am so in love with the colors of the kimono, just the beauty of the obi. Again, all the elements needed for the best of ichimatsu. And the boy, the pair, similarly, amazing face, but love the kimono with the flying swallows over a cloud pattern. Just so beautiful with the supplemental embroidery. You get completely lost just in the painterliness of the kimono on the best Koryusai dolls. Now, Koryusai, we recognize by the idea of his bright facial expression. Of course, we recognize by his signature. That's, of course, the smoking bullet. But one little element that frequently finds up on Koryusai Ningyô, particularly after the friendship doll movement, is this sort of, if you look at his hand, there's sort of a V-shaped chisel mark, beginning of the cut at the very, very end or the beginning of the finger division. And I think that's it's not on every one of his dolls, but it is frequent enough to be something to look out for as maybe an indication that the doll is by Koryusai. So, for example, these are 3 Koryusai Ningyô that I currently have, and actually they're behind me there, somewhere in the crowd, showing the bright facial expressions of the Koryusai, beautiful execution, beautiful kimono, all bearing the Koryusai signature and seal, which is ultimately the deciding factor. But when we look at their hands, each of them bear that distinctive V-shaped chisel mark. Interestingly, not all of the hands are the same quality. And so this is a good time to point out that Koryusai made ichimatsu-ningyô of varying levels, supplying to the ateliers that he did. They weren't all wanting the most expensive dolls. They wanted more affordable dolls. And so Koryusai obliged. And so frequently that plays out in either the scale of the piece, the size, and or how refined the hands are. Typically the faces are all just beyond reproach, but sometimes the hands become a little bit more simplified, as you see here, but again, all bearing that V-shaped chisel mark. Another style of ichimatsu particularly the boys that Koryusai was fond of in the 1930s, was having these boys dressed in dark ikat textiles, not the refined silk garment, but sometimes done more out of bast fiber or cotton, done in ikat. Beautiful Koryusai face, just the quintessential bright, happy expression. Lovely hands, but if you dial into the hand there, you can again see that V-shaped chisel mark at the apex of the finger. But I hasten to say that not all Koryusai ningyô have that feature. So here, again, another beautiful Koryusai boy, very, very late 1930s, right immediate pre-war period. And look at his hand. His hand does not share that feature, yet he has the Koryusai mark. So it's something of a pointer, but not necessarily the only indicator of whether it's a Koryusai doll or not. As I said, his style evolved over time. We take a look at some of his earlier dolls, and you see that large ginkgo eye slowly refining itself to evolve, if you will, into the very lovely naturalistic face as depicted in this Koryusai boy on the bottom. Now, Koryusai was the only son of Heikichi, and so he took up the mantle and became Koryusai too. His two eldest boys decided not to become ichimatsu-ningyô makers, and so Koryusai pinned all of his hopes on his youngest son, Hayao. Hayao was born in 1922 and passed on in 2004. And Hayao took his work very seriously. By all accounts, was a brilliant maker of a skill set almost, if not better, than Koryusai himself. Not coming into his own until the post-war period because of his age and economic vicissitudes and whatnot. And some of our reminiscence and the knowledge that we have about Koryusai in his early life come from interviews of Hayao before his passing, and also from Kikuko, his eldest daughter, who was married to the policeman who actually had to bail Koryusai out of jail, as I told in that sort of colorful anecdote earlier. But unfortunately, Koryusai's youngest son, Hayao, at the peak of his game, was in a traffic accident, suffered whiplash, and developed a tremor in his hand. The accident took place in 1965. And by 1966, he had a tremor in his hand, and he was no longer able to do menso, or the fine painting of the faces, which are so important to establishing their individuality and a hallmark of a quality doll, the menso. And so he was unable to continue life as an ichimatsu-ningyô maker. Now, at this point, Koryusai himself was quite up in age and in very ill health, so it is unclear whether he ultimately knew or not before his passing that Hayao would never become or would never be able to sustain his life as an ichimatsu-ningyô maker. So a very sort of tragic end to the direct Koryusai lineage. And again, I want to point out that Hayao was born in 22. So when the friendship doll movement came around, the friendship doll project came around, Hayao, his youngest, was only about 4 years old. His Hayao's older brothers were not participating. And so the deshi shown working with Koryusai so diligently during the friendship doll preparation was actually Fujimura Shiun, and who was an apprentice, shown about age 16 or 17 in this photograph. And so he worked alongside Koryusai with the Friendship Doll project, but also making ichimatsu-ningyô as Koryusai's student or deshi, ultimately going independent, establishing his own lineage as Fujimura Shiun the first. Now, Fujimura Shiun's son is Fujimura Kokan. Now, Fujimura Kokan I talk about in any number of talks because I think he's just the bomb in terms of current ichimatsu-ningyô making. But it's interesting because he trained as ichimatsu-ningyô makers do at the side of his father, but decided not to take the family lineage. And that lineage passed on to Kokan's nephew. Fujimura Kokan decided just to be himself, to go independent, to blaze his own trail, initially working under the name of Akimitsu Meiko. but becoming Fujimura Kokan, ultimately settling on the name Fujimura Kokan. And this is him at Yoshitoku Doll Company. And during my last doll tour there in 2019, he gave a beautiful demonstration of doll making. And I've always say that Fujimura Kokan, in terms of the quality of his gofun, the deftness of his handling of the menso, and also the quality of the textiles he uses, really has set the bar on contemporary ichimatsu-ningyô making. His style ventures far and wide, again, not traditional in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes having a little bit more of an anime, manga kind of feel to it, a little maybe cutesy than maybe I personally would prefer, but no one can deny his skill sets. And he actually came over to the United Federation of Doll Clubs annual convention a few years ago when it was held in Nashville, Tennessee, and displayed some of his wares and helped introduce his works to a new audience, the American audience, and that's myself and Fujimura Kokan. And then his disciple Meisho on the far right, she has gone independent and is an exceptional ichimatsu-ningyô maker in her own right. And Sayuri there next to me, a French doll reproduction artist of extraordinary skills. All bow to Sayuri for her skill sets in making French bisque dolls, all practically indistinguishable from the jumeaux and whatnot. Just so wonderful, wonderful individual. So Fujimura, all of these, the Koryusai, that lineage, all of that is discussed in depth in my recent book, Ichimatsu Japanese Play Dolls, which is available through my website. And I encourage you, please, if you're interested in Ichimatsu and knowing a little bit more, not only about Koryusai, but some of the artists that I briefly mentioned and the history of this really exceptional doll form, the quintessential Japanese doll form, the Ichimatsu. I encourage you to look at that book. And then I have a number of other publications out there if you're just more interested in Japanese doll history and cultural in general. Again, all available on my website, and I look forward to hearing from you about that. And so this has been another edition of Notes on Ningyô. And again, it's an ongoing series. And as I may have mentioned before, frequently these talks are a product of me being asked to give lectures to museums, doll clubs, all across the world, from Japan all the way to Bucharest, Romania. And afterward, I try and sort of fine-tune them and bring them down and present them in a condensed, somewhat condensed, if you believe it, this is short, video format that I'm now publishing on YouTube one by one by one by one, under this Notes on Ningyô. And so Master Craftsman, The Life and Works of Koryusai was one of these talks. And so if you are a member of a doll club or a docent group for a museum, or even just a general interest club. I once gave a doll talk to the veterans of foreign war in Helena, Montana. That was an interesting group. A little bit of pushback talking about Japanese dolls to the veteran of foreign wars, but hey, you got to roll with the punches. But anyway, I digress yet again. So again, this has been Alan Scott Pate, Antique Japanese Dolls, and look for me on my website. I have Instagram account, Facebook, all the usual suspects. And I do hope you have enjoyed this sort of in-depth look at one of the most important ningyô makers in Japanese history, Takizawa Kôryûsai II. And I look forward to seeing you again in future Notes on Ningyô. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, share examples of the dolls that you have. If you have questions, I feel lots and lots of questions. So again, Alan Scott Pate, and thank you, and wishing you all the best. Take care. Bye-bye.